no response at all. Mako did not come to Christmas. The compound in Benin that year was heavy with absence. We ate the rice, drank the palm wine, exchanged the gifts, but the joy was forced, the laughter hollow. Austin moved through the gathering like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. He greeted everyone, smiled at the children, thanked the cooks, but I saw him pause at the edge of the compound, looking toward the road to Wari, waiting for a car that never came. I found him there, in the evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red. "He's not coming," I said. It was not a question. Austin shook his head slowly. "I don't know what I did, Osiro. I have gone over everything in my mind, every conversation, every decision since our father died. I have tried to find the moment when I became his enemy. I cannot find it. You are not his enemy. Alice is his enemy, and she has convinced him that you are her." Austin turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw a grief deeper than the one he had carried at his father's funeral. "Then what do I do? How do I fight a ghost? How do I defend myself against accusations that are never spoken to my face, against a war fought with whispers and silences?" "You don't fight," I said. "You wait. You stay steady. You keep being the brother you have always been. Eventually, the whispers will become too loud to ignore. Eventually, Mako will hear a voice that is not Alice's. And when he does, you must be here, unchanged, waiting." Austin nodded, but his face held little hope. "And if he never hears? If Alice's voice is the only one that reaches him?" I had no answer for that. The new year brought no peace. Alice, emboldened by her success in isolating Mako from the Christmas gathering, intensified her efforts. She began reaching out to other family members, building alliances, recruiting sympathetic ears to her cause. She was careful, always careful, never accusing directly, always expressing concern, always framing her words as love for Mako, as protection of his interests. "Mako is so stressed," she would tell Auntie Osaragi. "This family situation is killing him. He barely sleeps. He just wants what is fair, but no one in Benin will listen to him. Mako feels so alone," she would confide to my mother. "He says the only person who truly understands is me. I try to tell him his family loves him, but he doesn't believe it anymore. Something broke in him at the funeral, and no one seems to care." Each conversation was a masterpiece of manipulation, planting seeds of doubt while maintaining the appearance of a concerned wife. The family, already fractured, began to splinter further. Some believed Alice, saw her as a devoted wife fighting for her husband against an indifferent family. Others saw through her, recognized the pattern of isolation and control, but found themselves powerless to intervene. The legal battle escalated. Mako's lawyer filed papers challenging Austin's right to administer any part of the estate. Austin's lawyer responded with offers of mediation. Mako rejected each offer. The properties remained frozen, caught in a limbo that benefited no one but the lawyers. And through it all, Izu watched, her heart breaking in silence. She called Mako every week, and every week Alice or one of the children told her he was unavailable. She wrote letters that went unanswered. She sent gifts for her grandchildren that were acknowledged with perfunctory thank you notes, nothing more. Her son, the child she had protected and nurtured, the son for whom she had spoken truth at the risk of everything, was being stolen from her, and she could do nothing to stop it. "Mako's wife has done what the ancestors could not do," my mother said to me one evening, her voice heavy with resignation. "She has divided what death itself could not divide. She has turned brother against brother, son against mother, family against itself. And the worst part is, she believes she is right. She believes she is protecting her husband. She cannot see that she is destroying him." I thought about Mako, alone in Wari with Alice and her whispers, cut off from the family that loved him, convinced that he was fighting for justice when he was really fighting ghosts. I thought about Austin, holding steady in Benin, refusing to retaliate, waiting for a brother who might never come back. I thought about Izu, trapped between her sons, her truth spoken but her peace destroyed. The War of the Roses, I realized, had entered a new phase. The first battle had been over rights, over public acknowledgement, over the visible markers of belonging. That battle had been won, or at least resolved. But the war itself continued, fought now in the invisible terrain of hearts and minds, in the whispers of a woman who would stop at nothing to secure what she believed her husband deserved. And in the silence between the brothers, in the unanswered calls and the unopened letters, in the compound in Benin where Austin stood alone and the apartment in Wari where Mako sat surrounded by Alice's certainties, the poison continued to spread, waiting to see what would survive when it had finished its work. The years in Benin City do not so much pass as accumulate, each one layering upon the last like the dust from the harmattan, settling into the cracks of buildings and the lines of faces until the landscape itself is transformed by patience and time. 5 years passed since Afosa's funeral. 5 years since Mako performed the rites and the truth was spoken. 5 years of slow, inexorable drift between brothers who had once shared a childhood, a father, a name. In that time, the compound in Benin had weathered seasons of rain and sun, its walls standing as witness to the gatherings that grew smaller each year, the silences that grew longer. The mango tree still dropped its fruit in season, and children still chased each other through the dusty yard, but the children were different now, belonging to a new generation that would inherit not just the land but the fracture that ran through it like a hidden fault line. Austin married Mercy in the second year after his father's death. She was from a good Benin family, her father a retired principal, her mother a trader in the new Benin market. They met through the careful introductions of relatives who thought it was time Austin had a wife, someone to share the weight of his solitary position. Mercy was quiet where Austin was reserved, thoughtful where he was deliberate. She had the calm patience of someone who had grown up in a large family, learning early that survival required the ability to read silences and navigate unspoken tensions. Their wedding was a modest affair by Benin standards, held in the compound under a white canopy that billowed in the harmattan breeze. The family came those who still spoke to each other, those who could sit in the same space without the air turning brittle. Mako did not come. He sent a gift, an expensive set of crystal glasses that sat unopened in Austin's parlor for months, a symbol of connection that no one knew how to use. Alice sent nothing, not even a message. The absence was noted, commented on in whispers, then filed away like all the other grievances that accumulated in the family's collective memory. Mercy learned quickly the landscape she had married into. In those first months, as she established herself in the compound, she watched and listened, piecing together the story that everyone knew but no one told directly. She heard Austin's version in the quiet moments after dinner, when he spoke of his brother with a mixture of love and bewilderment that time had not diminished. She heard other versions from the aunts who visited, from the cousins who came and went, from the elders who still gathered under the mango tree to discuss matters that never seemed to reach resolution. "Your husband's brother," Auntie Osaragi told her one afternoon, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might carry tales, "has been poisoned by that woman. A good man, a quiet man, but weak where it matters. He cannot see that the person who claims to love him is destroying everything he has. And now, with children coming, the stakes are higher. What will they inherit? Not just land and money, but a war that should have ended with their grandfather." Mercy listened, nodded, and kept her own counsel. She was not yet ready to enter the fray, if fray it could be called. She focused on building her home, on learning the rhythms of the compound, on preparing for the children she hoped would come. And they did come 3 in 4 years, boys and girls with Austin's eyes and Mercy's calm, children who would grow up knowing their Uncle Mako only as a name spoken in hushed tones, a photograph on the wall, a mystery they would spend their lives trying to solve. The children were Austin's joy and his grief. Joy because they filled the compound with life, with the chaos of childhood, with the promise of a future that might be different. Grief because every milestone, every birthday, every naming ceremony, every school achievement was marked by Mako's absence. The invitations went out, handwritten by Mercy, addressed to Worry. The replies came back, when they came at all, in the form of gifts sent through courier services, the accompanying notes brief and formal, signed by Mako alone. Alice's name never appeared. We should visit them, Mercy suggested once, in the quiet of their bedroom, the children finally asleep. Take the children, go to Worry. Surprise them. Perhaps if Mako sees his nieces and nephews, sees you in person, something will shift. Austin shook his head slowly. He had considered this, many times, in the long nights when sleep would not come. If I go uninvited, Alice will see it as an invasion. She will spin it as me coming to pressure Mako, to use the children as emotional manipulation. Mako will believe her because he believes everything she tells him. It will make things worse. Then what do we do? Wait forever? I don't know, Austin admitted. I only know that pushing makes it worse. I have tried, Mercy. I have called, written, sent messages through everyone who would carry them. Each time, the response is the same silence, or a lawyer's letter, or a formal refusal. He does not want me in his life. I have to accept that, even if I do not understand it. But acceptance is not the same as peace, and Austin carried his brother's absence like a stone in his chest, heavy and constant, something he had learned to live with but never forget. In Worry, life continued along different lines. Mako had risen in his civil service career, his quiet competence earning him promotions and respect. He was known in his community as a solid man, a family man, a man who kept to himself and did his work without complaint. No one who knew him in Worry would have guessed at the fracture that defined his family life, the brother he had not spoken to in years, the mother whose calls he no longer answered. Alice had built a world around them, a world in which she was the center and the protector, the one who saw clearly when others were blind. She had her circle women from church, from the market, from the neighborhood who heard her version of events and accepted it as truth. Mako's family in Benin, she told them, had never accepted him. They had used him to perform the funeral rites, then pushed him aside. They favored Austin, the blood son, and would have left Mako with nothing if she had not fought for him. The legal battles, the refusals to meet, the isolation, all of it was necessary, all of it was self-defense against a family that would devour them if given the chance. Mako heard these words daily, hourly, in the rhythm of his life. He heard them at breakfast, when Alice reviewed the latest communication from the family lawyers. He heard them at dinner, when she dissected the motivations behind a cousin's friendly call. He heard them in bed, in the dark, when she whispered her fears for their future, for their children, for the legacy that Austin would steal if they were not vigilant. The repetition wore grooves in his mind, channels through which all information flowed and was shaped. The children, 3 of them, like Austin's, grew up in this atmosphere. They knew they had relatives in Benin, but the relatives were shadowy figures, mentioned rarely and always with a certain tension. They knew they had an Uncle Austin, but the name was spoken like a warning, a reminder of the danger that lurked outside their carefully constructed world. They learned early not to ask too many questions, not to express curiosity about the family that existed beyond their mother's narratives. And yet, children see more than they are meant to. They saw their father's face when a letter from Benin arrived, the complicated expression that crossed his features before he handed it unopened to their mother. They heard the silences on the phone when their grandmother called, the way their father would stand motionless, listening to Alice's voice in the background, then walk away without speaking. They felt the weight of something unspoken, a presence in the house that was never named but never absent. In Benin, the compound adapted to the new reality. Family gatherings continued, but they were smaller now, the Wari contingent permanently absent. Birthdays were celebrated, marriages contracted, children born and named, all without Mako and his family. The absence became normal, expected, a fact of life like the Harmattan or the rains. People stopped asking when Mako would visit. They stopped saving him a seat at events. They stopped, in small ways and large, including him in the calculations of family life. But the legal matters ground on, impossible to ignore. The properties remained undivided, caught in a limbo that satisfied no one. Efosa's estate, meant to provide for his descendants, had become a source of constant friction, the lawyers on both sides generating mountains of paperwork and bills that ate into the very assets they were meant to protect. Every few months, a new proposal would emerge from one side or the other, and the cycle of rejection and counter-rejection would begin again. Austin, advised by elders who feared the complete dissolution of the family, tried a new approach. He proposed that the most contentious properties, the Acade plots, the Irwa farmland, be placed in a family trust, managed collectively for the benefit of all Efosa's descendants, including Mako's children and his own. The income would be shared equally. The control would be shared equally. No one would have more power than anyone else. Mako's lawyer rejected it within a week. The trust, Alice argued, was just another way for Austin to maintain influence, to keep his hand in the management of assets that should be simply divided and done with. She had convinced Mako that the only safe path was complete division, each asset cut in two and distributed, with no ongoing connection that would require trust or cooperation. What does she think will happen when we are gone? I asked my mother during one of our calls. The children will inherit this fight. They will grow up knowing their cousins as enemies, as the children of the people who wronged their parents. The fracture will become a chasm that no one can cross. My mother sighed, that weary sound I had come to know so well. Alice does not think about the children inheriting the fight. She thinks about the children inheriting the assets. She believes, truly believes, that Austin will cheat Mako if given the chance. Every proposal he makes, she interprets as a trap. Every gesture of goodwill, she reads as manipulation. There is no evidence that will convince her otherwise, because her conviction does not come from evidence. It comes from something deeper: fear, perhaps, or the need to be right, or the terrible knowledge that if she admitted she was wrong about Austin, she would have to admit she has spent years destroying her husband's family for nothing. I thought about this often in those years, as I built my own life in Lagos, as I watched my cousin's children grow through photographs and occasional visits. The tragedy was not that Alice was evil. She was not in any simple way. She was a woman who loved her husband and believed, with all her heart, that she was protecting him. But love, unmoored from truth, becomes a kind of violence. Protection, uncalibrated by reality, becomes imprisonment. She had built a prison for Mako and called it safety, and now they both lived inside it, unable to see the walls for what they were. The charade of normalcy was maintained through elaborate rituals of avoidance. When family members from Benin found themselves in worry on business, they did not call Mako. When Mako's children had achievements, school prizes, sports victories, church recognitions, the news reached Benin through circuitous routes, and congratulations were sent through intermediaries, never directly. When deaths occurred in the extended family, both sides attended the funerals but arranged their schedules to avoid extended contact, arriving at different times, sitting in different areas, leaving before the other arrived. Everyone acted as if this was normal. Everyone acted as if families naturally divided into factions that communicated only through lawyers and intermediaries. Everyone acted as if the love that had once bound brothers was a minor casualty, unimportant in the grand scheme of things. But the children noticed. Austin's eldest, a boy named Osezi after his grandfather Efosa, was 10 years old when he asked his father the question that had been forming in his mind for years. "Dad, why don't we ever see Uncle Mako and his family? Aren't they our relatives?" Austin was silent for a long moment, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He and Mercy had prepared for this moment, discussed how they would handle it, but knowing a question would come and facing it were different things. Yes, he said finally. They are our relatives. Your uncle Mako is my brother. We grew up together in this compound, in this house. Then why don't they visit? Why don't we visit them? Austin looked at his son, his intelligent, perceptive son who deserved better than evasion, and made a choice. There is a disagreement between us. A long-standing disagreement about some things that happened before you were born. It is complicated, and it involves things that adults sometimes have trouble resolving. Your mother and I have tried, many times, to make things right. But it takes two people to mend a disagreement, and your uncle is not ready yet. Osaze considered this. Will he ever be ready? I don't know, Austin admitted. I hope so. I pray so. Because he is my brother, and I love him, and I would like you to know your cousins. But some things take time. And some things, sadly, take longer than a lifetime. Osaze nodded, accepting this with the simple faith of childhood. But the question lingered, as such questions do, waiting for answers that might never come. In Wari, similar questions arose. Mako's eldest, a girl named Isohi, asked her mother about the relatives whose names she heard whispered, whose photographs she had glimpsed in an old album before it was put away. They are not our family, Alice said firmly. Not really. Your father's real father died before he was born. The people in Benin are relatives by circumstance, not by blood. They do not care about us, and we do not need them. But Isohi was not satisfied. She had seen the way her father looked at old photographs, the way his hands lingered on certain images before he closed the album and put it away. She had heard him speak in his sleep once, calling out a name Austin with a longing that did not match her mother's descriptions. She was young, but she was not blind. The years accumulated, each one adding another layer to the sedimentary rock of estrangement. Austin's children grew, attended school, made friends, began to form their own understandings of family. Mako's children did the same, in parallel, never meeting, never knowing the cousins who shared their blood and their history. The compound in Benin adapted to its partial emptiness, the rooms that had once held Mako's family now used for storage or left vacant, their doors closed but not locked, waiting for occupants who never came. I visited Benin whenever I could, drawn by the pull of family and the need to witness, to remember, to carry the story forward. Each visit, I saw Austin and Mercy building their life with quiet determination, raising their children with love and intention, maintaining the compound as a place of welcome for anyone who chose to come. And each visit, I felt the absence of Mako and his family like a missing limb, a phantom presence that ached even when unacknowledged. The elders, those who had navigated the original crisis, began to pass away. One by one, they joined the ancestors, taking with them the nuanced understanding of what had happened and why. The younger generation inherited only the fracture, not the context. They knew there was a rift, but the reasons became simplified, reduced to sound bites and slogans. Mako's wife poisoned him against the family. Austin stole the inheritance. Alice is a witch. Mercy is an outsider. The stories multiplied, each version serving the teller's purpose, none capturing the full complexity of love and loss and fear that had created this decades-long wound. Izu aged into her 70s, her once strong frame diminished by time and grief. She still lived in the compound, still maintained her place in the family, still prayed for both her sons every morning and evening. But the light in her eyes had dimmed, the vitality that had carried her through 2 marriages and unspeakable loss now worn thin by the one loss she could not bear, the loss of her son's presence, her son's voice, her son's love. She saw Austin's children daily, loved them fiercely, poured into them all the grandmotherly affection she had in abundance. They called her Mama Izu, ran to her with their triumphs and troubles, filled her days with the chaos and joy of growing up. But at night, alone in her room, she would look at the photograph of Mako as a boy, taken in this very compound, and weep. I carried him, she told me once, during a visit when the house was quiet and the children asleep. I carried him through the months after Zuko died, when I did not know if I would live or die myself. I carried him into Efosa's house, into his arms, into his heart. I watched him grow, watched him learn, watched him become a man. And now I do not know him. I do not know my own son. His wife has taken him from me, and I cannot get him back. Does he ever call? I asked, though I knew the answer. His children call, sometimes. When Alice is not watching. They whisper, tell me they love me, then hang up quickly before she catches them. They know. Even at their age, they know something is wrong. They are reaching across the silence, trying to hold onto something they cannot name. And I reach back, as far as I can, hoping one day they will be the bridge that brings their father home. The legal battles continued, but even they had lost urgency, becoming a background hum rather than a crisis. The properties remained undivided, the lawyers still billing, the brothers still estranged. Neither side would yield, neither side would compromise, and so the stalemate persisted, a frozen conflict that defined the family as surely as its living members. In Lagos, I watched from my Akate apartment, close enough to the disputed properties to see them daily, far enough from the family to maintain some perspective. The land Efosa had bought, the land that was meant to build a legacy, sat in the hands of developers now, some of it leased, some of it awaiting the resolution that never came. The income accumulated in escrow accounts, growing but inaccessible, a fortune that no one could touch because no one would trust. I thought often about the War of the Roses, that distant English conflict that had given me a metaphor for our family's struggle. In that war, two houses had fought for the crown, tearing a nation apart for generations. In ours, two brothers fought for an inheritance, tearing a family apart for the same span. The stakes were smaller, no thrones, no kingdoms, no battles on sunlit fields, but the damage was just as real, just as lasting, just as tragic. And everyone acted as if all was well. At family gatherings, the name of Mako and his family was carefully avoided, a conversational minefield that everyone navigated with practiced skill. When outsiders asked about the Wari branch, they received vague answers: they are well, they are busy, they don't travel much anymore, that conveyed nothing while appearing to convey everything. The children learned not to ask, not to wonder, not to notice the empty spaces at the table, the gifts that went unacknowledged, the photographs that showed only half the family. The compound in Benin stood as it always had, its walls solid, its roof intact, its mango tree still dropping fruit in season. But something vital had leached out of it, some essential quality of family that cannot be maintained by walls alone. The laughter that echoed there was genuine but incomplete, the love that filled it real but partial. An entire branch of the family tree had been pruned away, and the tree itself, though it continued to grow, would always bear the mark of that amputation. I thought of Mako sometimes, alone in Wari with Alice and her certainties, cut off from everything he had known, convinced he was fighting for justice. I thought of Austin, steady in Benin, waiting for a brother who might never return. I thought of the children, growing up on both sides of the divide, learning to see each other as strangers, as enemies, as the inhabitants of a parallel universe they would never visit. And I thought of the ancestors Zuko, Efosa, and all those who had come before, watching from wherever ancestors watch, seeing their descendants tear apart what they had built, powerless to intervene, waiting for the healing that might never come. The years rolled on, as years do, indifferent to human grief. The harmattan came and went, the rains fell and stopped, the mango tree bloomed and fruited in its season. Austin's children grew taller, started school, made friends, began to form their own lives beyond the compound. Mako's children did the same, in a city 3 hours away, carrying the same blood, the same history, the same unspoken longing for connection. And between them, the silence stretched, unbroken and unbreakable, a monument to everything that had been lost and might never be found again. The night Efosa died, the rains came late to Benin City. They arrived not as the gentle prelude of early showers but as a violent assault, thunder cracking the sky open like an egg, lightning illuminating the compound in stark, unforgiving flashes. Inside the old house, in the room where Efosa had spent his last weeks propped against pillows that smelled of illness and palm oil, his breath had finally stopped. The family gathered, wails rising and falling with the storm, but in the moments before the end, something else had happened. Something that those closest to him would carry like a secret too heavy for words. I learned of it years later, in fragments, from my mother and from Auntie Izu, who could not speak of it without her voice catching. In those final days, when Efosa knew as dying men always know that the end was near, he had tried to speak. He had tried, more than once, to call the elders together, to name his heir, to do what custom demanded and what his heart dreaded. But each time, something stopped him. Each time, the words died in his throat, choked by a fear so deep it had roots in places no living man could see. The fear was not of death itself. Efosa had made his peace with dying, had accepted that his body was failing, that the time had come to join his ancestors. The fear was of what might happen if he spoke the truth. The fear was of the voodoo that haunted our family like a ghost that had never been properly buried. To understand this fear, you must understand something about our world that the educated children of Lagos and the sophisticated cousins in London prefer to forget. In Benin, the visible world is only half the story. Beneath it, running like the roots of the ancient Irako tree, is another world entirely, a world of spirits and curses, of charms and incantations, of powers that can reach across any distance and strike at the most vulnerable moment. The educated deny it, the Christians pray against it, but in the quiet moments, in the dark, even the most skeptical feel its presence. And Efosa, for all his books and his modern ways, believed. The voodoo in question had entered the family through channels no one could trace with certainty. Some said it came from Zako's death, from the grief of a young wife left alone, from the desperation of a family trying to hold together. Others said it was older, woven into the fabric of the family by jealous rivals, by spurned lovers, by the accumulated weight of generations of rivalry and resentment. What everyone knew, what no one could prove, was that certain members of the family were protected or cursed by powers that operated beyond the reach of ordinary law. There was the cousin who had tried to claim a piece of land and died within the year, his body ravaged by a wasting illness the doctors could not name. There was the aunt who had spoken against an elder at a family meeting and woke the next morning unable to move her right side, a paralysis that persisted until she made public apology and sacrifice. There was the uncle who had challenged the distribution of an inheritance and lost not only his case but his mind, wandering the streets of Benin for years before a truck ended his suffering. These stories were not told openly, not to outsiders, not to children. But they were known, passed down in whispers, filed away in the collective memory as warnings. Cross certain lines, and the consequences were not legal but spiritual. Challenge certain powers, and the response would not come in court but in the marrow of your bones. Efosa had grown up with these stories. He had seen enough with his own eyes to know that some things could not be explained by science or reason. And in the matter of his inheritance, in the question of who would stand as his heir, he was trapped between two forces, each with its own claim and its own capacity for destruction. On one side stood the tradition, the custom, the public truth. Mako was his first son, born to his wife, raised in his house. By every law of the land, written and unwritten, Mako was his heir. To name anyone else was to invite chaos, to fracture the family, to deny the very foundation upon which Benin society had been built for centuries. On the other side stood the blood, the secret, the private truth. Austin was his son, his only biological son, the child of his body and his love. To deny Austin was to deny himself, to cut off his own line, to leave his legacy to a boy who carried another man's blood and another man's spirit. And beyond that, beyond the personal, there was the fear of what Zako's spirit might do if his son was denied. Zako had died young, had never seen his child, had never held him or named him or passed on his blessings. His spirit was restless, hungry for acknowledgement. If Mako was not recognized as Zako's son, if he was given Efosa's inheritance and treated as Efosa's heir, would Zako's anger turn on the family? Would his ghost bring calamity upon them all? These were the questions that tormented Efosa in his final months. These were the thoughts that kept him awake when the pain allowed him to sleep, that haunted his dreams when sleep finally came. He was caught between two truths, two duties, two fears, and there was no path that did not lead through danger. The elders came to him often in those last weeks. They sat by his bed, their faces grave, their voices gentle. They did not press him, custom forbade it, but their presence was a question, a waiting, an expectation. They needed to know. The family needed to know. The ancestors needed to know. Who would stand in Efosa's place? Who would pour the libation? Who would inherit the lands, the houses, the responsibilities? And each time, Efosa would begin to speak. His mouth would open, his eyes would meet theirs, and the words would form on his lips. But before they could emerge, something would stop him. A shadow would cross the room, a chill would run through the air, a memory would rise of that cousin wasting away, of that aunt struck silent, of that uncle wandering the streets with empty eyes. And the words would die, swallowed by fear, buried in the silence. My mother was with him on one of these occasions. She had come to sit with him, to bring him soup, to keep him company in the long afternoons when the house was quiet. He was lucid that day, more lucid than he had been in weeks, and he began to talk. "Ada," he said, using her childhood name, "I am leaving a mess behind. 2 sons, 1 inheritance, a secret that everyone knows and no one speaks. I have tried to be fair. I have tried to do right by everyone. But I am dying, and I have not fixed it." My mother took his hand. "You still have time, Efosa. Call the elders. Tell them your will. They will honor it." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before, not the calm wisdom of the scholar, not the quiet authority of the elder, but the raw terror of a man facing something he could not control. "You don't understand," he whispered. "There are things in this family that are older than me, older than my father, older than anyone living. Powers that have been here since before the Oba's palace was built. If I name Austin, if I set aside Mako, what will happen to him? What will happen to my son?" "Nothing will happen," my mother said, but even as she spoke, she heard the hollow note in her own voice. She knew the stories. She knew what could happen. "Nothing." Efosa laughed, a bitter sound that turned into a cough. "You know better. You know what happened to Osike Bova when he challenged the inheritance. You know what happened to Iyama when he spoke against the elders. You know that some things are not controlled by law or by reason. If I name Austin, I may be signing his death warrant. And if I name Mako, I betray my own blood and anger Zako's ghost. Either way, someone suffers. Either way, the family fractures. And I lie here, helpless, unable to choose which destruction I prefer." My mother had no answer. She sat with him, holding his hand, as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the room grew dark. When she left, he was still staring at the ceiling, still trapped between his fears. The last attempt came 3 days before his death. The elders had gathered, summoned by Auntie Izu, who could no longer bear to see her husband tormented. They filed into his room, 7 men in white, their faces set in the solemn lines of those who carry the weight of tradition. They sat in a semicircle around his bed, and the oldest among them, Paidok Pai, spoke. Ephosa, our son, we have come to hear your will. The time is short. The ancestors wait. Tell us who will stand in your place, who will pour your libation, who will inherit your name. Speak, and we will witness. The room fell silent. Even the insects outside seemed to pause, waiting. Ephosa looked at the faces around him, men he had known his entire life, men who had sat with his father, men who carried the same secrets and the same fears. He opened his mouth. And then it happened. Later, those who were there would describe it differently. Some said a wind came through the room, though the windows were closed. Some said a shadow passed across the sun, though the sky was clear. Some said they heard a voice, not Ephosa's voice, speaking words they could not understand. All of them felt it, a presence, a weight, a warning. Ephosa's face changed. The words that had been forming died on his lips. His eyes, which had been focused on Padokpai, shifted to something else, something behind the elders, something only he could see. His hand rose, trembling, pointing at the empty air. You, he whispered. You are here. The elders turned, but there was nothing. Only the wall, only the shadows, only the accumulated darkness of a room where a man was dying. You cannot have him, Ephosa said, his voice stronger now, almost defiant. He is my son. My blood. You cannot take him. The room grew cold. Padokpai, a man who had seen more than most, began to pray, the old prayers, the ones that called on ancestors to protect the living. The others joined him, their voices rising in a desperate chorus, trying to push back whatever had entered. And Ephosa, his strength failing, his defiance fading, spoke his last words on the matter. Not to the elders, not to his wife, but to the presence only he could see. I will not choose, he said. I cannot. Let them decide. Let them fight. Let the living bear what I could not. I am going to you now. Leave my sons alone. Then he closed his eyes, and the presence withdrew. The room warmed. The elders stopped praying and looked at each other, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They had witnessed something none of them would ever speak of openly, something that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Ephosa did not speak again. Not about the inheritance, not about his sons, not about anything. He lay in that room for 3 more days, his body failing, his mind somewhere else, until the rains came and he finally let go. When my mother told me the story, years later, we were sitting in her kitchen in Lagos, the city noise a distant hum, the past pressing close. She had never spoken of it before, had carried it like a stone in her chest, and now it spilled out in a rush, as if the telling itself was a kind of release. He was not afraid of dying, she said. He was afraid of what would happen after. He was afraid that his choice would bring destruction on the ones he loved. And so he made no choice, and destruction came anyway. The very thing he tried to prevent, the war between his sons, the fracture of his family, happened because he could not bring himself to act. He saw something in that room, I said. The elders saw it too. My mother nodded slowly. Something. Whether it was Zuko's ghost, or something older, or just the manifestation of his own fear, I cannot say. But it was real. It was there. And it silenced him. For all his learning, for all his wisdom, he could not overcome that fear. He died with the truth inside him, and the truth died with him. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about Ephosa, trapped in that room, caught between his love for Austin and his duty to Mako, between his fear of the visible world and his terror of the invisible one. I thought about the choice he could not make, the words he could not speak, the legacy of silence he left behind. The irony, of course, was that his silence did not prevent the destruction. It only ensured that the destruction would come without guidance, without clarity, without the one voice that might have made a difference. By refusing to choose, he left his sons to choose for themselves, armed only with their grief, their suspicions, and the whispers of those who had their own interests to protect. If Ephosa had spoken, would it have changed anything? Would the elders have accepted his choice, whatever it was? Would Austin and Mako have accepted it? Would Alice's manipulations have found less fertile ground? Would the family have found a way to heal, rather than a way to fracture? These questions have no answers. They hover over the family like the ghost that visited Ephosa's room, present but unseeable, felt but unprovable. What we know is what happened, the silence, the fracture, the decades of estrangement. What we imagine is what might have been, a different path, a different story, a different legacy. In the compound in Benin, the room where Ephosa died is still there. It is used for storage now, filled with boxes and old furniture, the bed long gone, the windows often shuttered. But those who know the story avoid it after dark. They say the air in that room is different, heavier, charged with something that cannot be explained. They say if you sit there long enough, in the silence, you can almost hear a voice, Ephosa's voice, struggling to speak, struggling to choose, struggling against the fear that silenced him forever. I have been in that room. I have sat in the quiet, listening. I have felt the weight of what happened there, the accumulated grief of a choice not made, a truth not spoken, a family not saved. And I have thought about fear, how it shapes us, how it stops us, how it reaches from the invisible world into the visible one and changes everything. Ephosa was a good man. He was a loving father, a respected elder, a keeper of tradition. But he was also a man who believed in things he could not see, feared powers he could not control, and in the end, that belief and that fear cost his family everything. The voodoo that shut his mouth was not just in the room that day. It was in his blood, in his history, in the stories he had heard since childhood. It was in the collective memory of a people who had learned, over centuries, that some forces are too dangerous to challenge, some truths too costly to speak. And so he died in silence, leaving his sons to fight a war he could have prevented. He died in fear, leaving his family to suffer the consequences of his fear. He died with the truth inside him, and the truth died with him, and the living have been paying for it ever since. The rains still come to Benin City, late or early, violent or gentle. The compound still stands, the mango tree still fruits, the family still gathers. But in the room where Ephosa could not speak, something lingers, not a ghost, not a curse, but the echo of a choice not made, a truth not told, a father's love trapped forever between his fear and his duty. And sometimes, late at night, when the compound is quiet and the ancestors are near, those who listen closely can hear it, the sound of a man trying to speak, trying to choose, trying to save his sons from the war he knew was coming. The sound of silence, louder than any words, heavier than any grief, lasting longer than any life.